first thing is looking at your supply chain map. What does the data tell you? Are there trends or indicators and patterns that are obvious or not? So, for example, Apple realized they had two major critical suppliers for their iPhones within a mile of an active volcano in the Philippines. That's a clear signal. That's, your fallback position isn't good. And there's more than 20 active volcanoes around the world today, so it's not improbable. What do your personal experiences tell you? Where are you running blind? Where do you have just no intelligence on what's going on in that part of the world? Sometimes just an offhanded comment, made at a meeting can be the source of an idea. What are the assumptions that we're using?
Thanks so much for joining another edition of The Never Ending Climb for a Stronger Supply Chain and Procurement for Companies Running SAP. Today is my great pleasure to introduce Rob Handfield. And Rob is a professor of supply chain management at NC State, and he does a lot of work with industry around resilience. I think resilience is one of those things that I know we're all feeling a little nervous about. Rob, thanks so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure. Really happy to be here, Sean.
Awesome. So when we think about resilience and then we think about things that we can use to evaluate our resilience and improve our resilience in our supply chain, especially for those folks that are aimed in procurement, what are some of the things that they need to consider first, at least as concepts, right? I think we were talking a little earlier about some of the domestic or relatively local support and capabilities and some of those things that are so distributed right now. Another evergreen going sideways, and we're in for another world of hurt.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say that, most companies today don't really know who makes their stuff, right? So they might know who are their, tier one suppliers, but they have no idea who their tier two or their suppliers are, or even their suppliers or tier three. And I really was exposed to this during COVID. I was asked to join the Joint Acquisition Task Force, which was stood up by the White House to try to identify sources of PPE, gowns, gloves, drugs like propofol, ventilators. And it was incredible to me. I was working with the Strategic National Stockpile that is supposed to carry this stuff for emergencies. And one of the people there said, I had no idea all this stuff came from China. And I just couldn't, that was astounding to me that people had no idea where the stuff comes from. And of course, when China shut down the borders, we ran out of this stuff and we couldn't get it. So I think the first thing is to understand, who is in your supply chain and where your stuff is coming from.
Yeah, I think that sense of who's in it, where is it coming from, and the sensitivities, right? If you have some really key components that are difficult to substitute, those feel like some of the first pieces to really dial in for the right level of resilience that has to be decided for the organization.
No, that's absolutely right. And, and when you start going down to the raw material level, you very quickly can identify sources where, we're really vulnerable. And in one of my books, latest book called Flow, How the Best Supply Chains Thrive, we talk about kill shot analysis. And, kill shot is a military term. And, if that supplier goes down and they're a kill shot supplier, your entire supply chain goes down. I mean, it's the end. And that's exactly what happened during COVID. But, unfortunately, we're also exposed in a number of other areas. Semiconductors is another place where we're highly, highly reliant on China and on Taiwan, especially, and Korea. And these are areas that are not always really stable when you look at it. Our drugs, even generic drugs, for instance, most of our generic drugs have active pharmaceutical ingredients and others that are produced in China and India. And a lot of the factories over there now are receiving letters from the FDA that are saying, hey, your quality standards are not okay. And they're shutting them down. So we're running out of drugs like, ADHD medicine, Vyvanse. We're running out of sumatriptan. We're running out of, just basic generic drugs. We're running out of because of quality issues. So as you start understanding what your supply chain looks like, you begin to identify sources of, possible failure, single sources, um, areas where, if something bad happens, it will have a ripple effect throughout all of your products as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I can think of an automotive manufacturer that was having trouble getting a key component into their wiring harness. And, it's funny, it's very difficult to build and ship a car that works
Yeah.
with part of the wiring harness missing. And it's a pain in the what to try to add that in when it arrives at the dealership. But there were all sorts of vehicles being shipped to dealerships with critical component missing that
Yeah.
they couldn't sell it until they couldn't let it leave the lot until this other piece actually arrived, and then they were paying the dealers to go and install these pieces as
All this.
workarounds and ways to try to overcome this. It's really spectacular because I think the assumption has been for so long that just in time and trim, 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 and cut, 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 and then before you know it, you've got about this much slack in a supply chain, and one little sneeze and you're toast.
Yeah. No, that's absolutely right. And, just in time works very well, by the way, when you have local suppliers. So
Yeah.
Honda, for instance, 95% of the components in a Honda vehicle are American because they have all of their suppliers, clustered around their plant in Marysville, Ohio. And their motto is you buy where you sell and you sell where you buy. But as a lot of the big three, for instance, during COVID, when COVID arrived, they sort of panicked and they told all the chip makers, okay, we're holding off for a while. Well, what happened? Everyone started buying cars like crazy. And they said, no, we made a mistake. Start shipping it back to us. Well, by then they told them, look, hey, get to the end of the line. We've already committed our capacity to all the electronics manufacturers. So you had, Ford and GM had, entire like fleets of automobiles sitting there because they didn't
Hopefully not collecting hail damage or something like that while they were sitting waiting.
because they didn't have the chips for the for the dashboards for the electronics. So
Yep. That's amazing. So when you're talking to an organization and the conversation is turning to great resilience, and we need to watch out for kill shots, and we need to make sure that we're understanding who is in our supply chain, they're tier one, they're tier two, ideally they're tier three. What are the most important things to think about and then to execute? Because I think about that stress testing as being like, unless you're executing the test, it's all just theory. What are some of the most important things that you encourage people to make sure they think about and do, and then execute?
so I think what is going to be the most important thing in the next few years is, as you said, stress testing. Well, what does that look like? The fact is there are supply chain disruptions pretty much now every day or every other day. And,
Yeah.
we're talking about bankruptcies, regulatory compliance, cyber attacks, geopolitical events, human health issues, labor disruptions. A big one is, power outages, natural disasters. All of these things can happen. But you ask yourself the question, well, would we be impacted by that? The only way you'll know if you'll be impacted by that is if you have that supply chain map that we were talking about. You need to know exactly, who your suppliers are in your tier one and at least tier two. You need to, again, know the geographic location of where these suppliers are. You need to understand, do they have another facility or plant available to manufacture that product if they get damaged? And with that information, you can start to build what are called, stress tests. And stress tests are just that. They're basically a way of identifying what might happen if ... So how do you go about, building those scenarios? So there's a number of ways you can do that. The first thing is looking at your supply chain map. What does the data tell you? Are there trends or indicators and patterns that are obvious or not? So, for example, Apple realized they had uh, two major critical suppliers for their iPhones within a mile of an active volcano in the Philippines. That's a clear signal. That's, your fallback position isn't good. And there's more than 20 active volcanoes around the world today, so it's not improbable. Um, what do your personal experiences tell you? Where are you running blind? Where do you have just no intelligence on what's going on in that part of the world? Um, sometimes just an offhanded comment, made at a meeting can be the source of an idea. What are the assumptions that we're using to say, oh, we can just move our product to Vietnam? You see the infrastructure in Vietnam? What the assumption is you won't have a problem there. Uh,
That's
don't.
a big assumption.
That's a
Sure can
big
be.
assumption. So you got to push back on some of these assumptions and really ask yourself the question, what would we do if? And people sometimes have these throwaway solutions that are not going to work, are not going to be effective.
Yeah. And then on top of that, the supply chain distance traveled that you highlighted. From my background, deep exposure to the pure logistics side of things for rail, ocean, truck. And I tend to think about things like weather disruption of, there's three highways that you can get between A and B. And if you think along the West Coast, you've got to go through the Rockies. Well, guess what? If you're crossing the Rockies and there's an avalanche there and extra cold temperatures there, and guess what? Everything just took a 24 to 48 hour hit, just like this.
Yeah.
And it happens almost every year. And some supply chains seem to act as if, oh my God, how could this possibly happen? Supplier, you need to fix this. Otherwise, we're going to shut down. And this reaction just seems so spectacularly unreasonable in the context of it's almost an annual event. And
Yeah.
then you stack something like that on top of something that doesn't happen every year, something that is a little like genuinely one every 5, one every 20, or one every 50 years. And all of a sudden, you do have a massive impact on part of your supply chain that people might claim later, how could we have seen it coming?
Yeah. Yeah. No,
Yeah.
what you've just identified is, if you can think of a 2 by 2 matrix, which is potential impact, and then the other is likelihood or probability. And, it's the ones that are the high probability, high impact, the ones you got to worry about. But, sometimes the low probability ones, you also got to think about because they're low probability, but they might happen. It's like you're sitting under, a coconut tree and a coconut falls down, and hits you in the head.
Yeah.
It's there's no way you can predict that. There's no
Yeah.
way that any forecast or probabilistic model can tell you that. So I think that's where it really comes down to understanding and building out your network, but then really then pushing it and pushing the envelope and say, well, let's really be creative here. Let's identify what would happen if there was a hurricane, if there was a typhoon. And the other thing that we don't think about also is the net impact of China. Um, China is rapidly acquiring and taking possession of most of the major ports in Africa. And Africa is the dominant source of critical materials. Most of the cobalt comes from the Congo, owned by Chinese mines. The rail line from the Congo to Angola, the port of Angola, is owned by China. Port of Angola is largely owned by China. So there's some real geopolitical concerns here in terms of global trade and implications for policy as to how we start to navigate some of these waters if and when China does take control of some of these key logistics elements.
I find the common discussion point, something like oil prices and OPEC. Yet OPEC, last time I looked, controlled less than a quarter of the supply,
Mm-hmm.
whereas China now has control over 60, 70, 80% of several of those key minerals. And I think that's one of those components where that's a key component in your supply chain, this is not something to be taken lightly, because at that point, it's not just pricing influence, it is outright price control.
Yeah. We also don't really understand how vulnerable we are when it comes to China, especially in global logistics. Um, if you look at, almost 80% of the products we get in North America are imported through containers, through global shipping. Well, you know, 98% of all marine containers are produced by Chinese controlled companies. They also make 60% of all the ships built in China. And they also, control a lot of the ports in many parts of the world. So, if when China shuts down or if they decide to stop,
They
shipping,
decide they don't want to share for any reason.
we are completely beholden to, Chinese shipping industries. We don't really build ships or containers in this country.
Yeah. It is remarkable how interdependent the supply chain has become, and the risks that that introduces. On one hand, it may be advantageous from a unit price perspective. And we can theorize how, for instance, key stocks or key supplies or key reserves of things may have ended up being supplied by the lowest price bidder, as can often happen through the RFP process. But the considerations in that evaluation of which bid to take, I think, have now had some new variables introduced that perhaps not quite as critical, or perhaps not viewed as essential several years ago.
Right. No, I agree. And the term supply chain resilience that's not a really favored term that I like, because it sort of implies, you've got to create this brick wall of against something that you don't know what it is. And that's the problem, is we don't know what it is. And so we've coined a term called supply chain immunity, that we wrote a book on, which says, hey, immunity is a good metaphor, because if you think about it, you've got T cells in your body, and when they, experience an attack or disruption, they go into recovery mode very quickly. And, I think that's where we need to get to is, we can't plan for everything, but we need to have a plan for when stuff does go wrong. And if we can identify and narrow down where we think it's going to go wrong, then we're going to have a better plan for it.
And the more we learn, the more research we do, and the better help we get from folks like yourself to help us consider where we have blinders on, where we have biases, where we have the, oh, that'll never happen to us. Wait, what just happened? Can
Yeah.
anyone believe it?
Yeah.
Those kinds of considerations of the blinders and the biases that get in the way of effective immunity in being designed and built into our supply chains, I think, are the areas where it's most important to make sure that we don't go into the garage and try to do it all ourselves with those blinders and biases on, but rather seek help and look up and out at what good looks like from some of the leading minds and organizations out there. What are some of the, maybe you have a favorite example of either blinders or bias that have gotten in the way of, or have come back and reared their ugly head right after somebody just declared their supply chain resilience?
Well, like I said, I think people overlook global warming is the biggest driver today. And the number of typhoons and hurricanes and weather events, droughts, they're escalating. It's no surprise that we're getting these record rainfalls and record hurricanes and so forth. So, I think we have to be realistic that this is going to get worse before it gets better. I don't see the, global warming suddenly taking a nosedive and going away. And the other part of it, I think, is there's something I like to do called wargaming, where wargaming involves, and when we're working on building these serious gaming platforms, where you can create these stress test scenarios and you can put them into a platform where, you're a decision maker, and you can practice what happens if something really bad happens. And you can identify, actions we would take to mitigate. And some of those actions are, well, like I said, we'll find a second source, or we'll go to this source. Well, no, everyone else is going after that same second source. So that's not really an option. So it it makes people, I think, creating that awareness in our supply chain managers and executives, and not just in supply chain, but for the entire business. How can we make our supply chains more immune and make decisions that allow us more flexibility, even in new product development, for instance?
100%. One of the things I love that you highlighted there is don't wait until you need it to go and get that secondary supplier, because by the time you call them, they're already sold out. And
Yep.
this played out with a chemical company in the last, I'll call it 4.5 years, where they were one of several chemical companies. And when COVID hit, they had the most brilliant response. I bet you'd love it if you haven't already heard about it. I won't name names today, but what they did is they went to all of their suppliers and they said, guys, ship me double. And all of the other chemical companies that were buying these same chemicals from these same suppliers were saying, no, you don't give me more than a 5% price increase. You keep your prices down. This company instead said, guys, the game has changed. I don't care about the price. You ship me double. Guess what happened? This company more than doubled their market share, and they had the supply that they could turn around and sell to their customers, where all of the traditional biases and traditional things that we've always done it this way of don't increase your price too much, Mr. Supplier. They
Yeah.
had nothing to sell, and
Yeah.
their market share absolutely tanked. And some of them are still trying to recover from that. So I love that kind of an example as a story of how are your biases, how are your assumptions coming back to bite you. And sometimes it's not having a playbook or not having the recognition of a strategy that you're ready to dust off and switch it up when
Yeah.
something really big has changed. So, Rob, when you think about gaming platforms and you think about increased immunity, if there were just a couple of things that you would want every supply chain and procurement leader to take away from having watched this, what would you hope they remember 6 weeks, 6 months later?
So I think the number one thing is, you know, do your supply chain map, like start building your supply chain map. And, people are saying, well, I can use AI to do that. AI doesn't work very well. I mean, it makes a lot of mistakes and it doesn't validate. So I think you have to, build better relationships with your suppliers and ask them, hey, can you tell me where you're getting your stuff so that, I can understand. I don't want to disintermediate you, but I need to understand what that mapping looks like. The second thing is, once you get that mapping, understand your vulnerabilities. Where are the single sources? Where are their capacity problems? Where are the mom and pop shops that might, be closing down? So understanding and pinpointing your vulnerabilities. And the third is, I would say is then start to do that stress testing, start to identify, potential scenarios that could come together, whether it's hurricanes, typhoons, geopolitical events, volcanoes, and really then, start to look at what you would do under those situations. And I think that can open up a lot of opportunities. And again, building a playbook, is the number one thing you can do. At least come up with a playbook for what you will do if something bad happens. You can't predict what might happen, but you can at least know how you're going to react when something happens.
Yeah. Instead of making it up on the fly when it happens while
Yeah,
you're stressed.
exactly. Yeah.
Absolutely. No substitute for being prepared.
Yeah.
Rob, this has been so insightful. I am really grateful for you joining us today. Thank you so very, very much. And for all of you watching, this has been another edition of The Never Ending Climb for a Stronger Supply Chain and Procurement Company running SAP. Rob, thank you so much again.
My pleasure. Thanks, Sean.